further ado, I'm happy to welcome today's conversationalist, Mark Danner from English and Journalism, in conversation with Joyce Carol Oates, visiting professor of English.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be introducing Mark Danner and interviewing him today. This will be only the third interview in my entire life. First was with Doris Lessing in the 1970s, and the second was with Mike Tyson in 1986. So it's going to be quite a contrast and very exciting.
It's a lot to live up to.
Well, Mark Danner is one of our most distinguished and honored journalists, belonging to that small category of writers of nonfiction who have revitalized the genre. If you had the good fortune to have read, for instance, Mark's coverage of the Trump campaign and presidency for the New York Review of Books, you have already experienced the extraordinary quality of his prose. So let me just read the first two paragraphs of What He Could Do, which is from the March 23rd, 2017 issue. I thought, since it's almost a year ago, and this is it's just so brilliantly written. This is the first two paragraphs. What He Could Do. Standing beneath the dais on Inauguration Day, squeezed uncomfortably between the Washington establishment gathered at the west front of the Capitol and Trump's hooting supporters on the lawn below. Lock her up, they chanted when Hillary Clinton was introduced. I marveled that the rain that had threatened for hours chose to fall at the precise second the newly sworn president opened his mouth to speak. It seemed a grim joke, so obvious as to be in bad taste, bringing forth inevitable cliches of an age of Trump ushered in by weeping skies. I felt the water run down my face. All umbrellas had been confiscated. And yet it took only a few hours to learn I'd been mistaken. You know, I looked at the rain, the expansive new president told the black-tied attendees at the Liberty Ball that evening, which just never came. By the next day, he was telling CIA employees that God looked down and he said, "We're not going to let it rain on your speech." Soon he was raving about the sunshine. It remains to be seen whether we are truly, quote, witnessing the birth of a new political order, quote. It is clear a month into Trump's ascension that we are all his prisoners, held fast in the projected drama of his mind. As the battle over the new political order is enacted on a national stage, we have all become the dragoon antagonists in the play. This is what it is to live in the realm of the big man. His drama, perforce, is ours. Relentless political struggle, permanent revolution, shattering of norms, scandal and controversy, the Capitol hip-deep in broken crockery. This is what his supporters signed on for, and this is what he is determined to give them. Perhaps he knows how to give them little else. Mark Danner is the author of a number of books on foreign affairs and international conflict, including Stripping the Body, Politics, Violence, War, 2009, The Secret Way to War, the Downing Street Memo and Iraqi War's Buried History, 2006, and his most recent, the aptly titled Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War. For these harrowing and beautifully written books, Mark has received major awards, including a MacArthur Fellowship, a National Magazine Award for Reporting, 3 prizes from the Overseas Press Club, and the Carrie McWilliams Award from the American Political Science Association. He has been a visiting critic at the American Academy in Rome and is a fellow of the Institute of the Humanities at New York University. A 1981 magna cum laude graduate of Harvard, where he majored in philosophy, English literature, and aesthetics, Mark has written for the most distinguished publications of our time. He divides his time between Bard College in the fall and Berkeley, where he is professor in the Graduate School of Journalism. So please join me in welcoming Mark. So Mark is a wonderful interviewer, and I just have a few questions. So I'm going to ask a question, I'm going to just stand back. So since this is an academic setting, my question is, how has your academic background, I know this is philosophy, also religion, English literature, and aesthetics, Has that been a particular value in your work, in your writing?
Goodness, that's an interesting question. I wish my parents were here. I could tell them it was all worthwhile. First of all, I'm just delighted to be here. I've attended various terrific events at the Townsend Center, and I'm very pleased to be invited and to be with you here today. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Joyce, for coming and doing this. That introduction was lovely. I really learned as an undergraduate, I think, how to read. And I think learning how to read is quite a universal skill that can be applied to all sorts of things that you wouldn't immediately think it could be. When I went to Iraq in 2003, we were in the middle of a series of suicide bombings, which began with the so-called Ramadan offensive, when you had five simultaneous suicide bombings. One of them I was just about in front of, which can't get any better for a reporter. In front of the Red Cross, boom! It killed 12 people. It sort of lit these fires in which you saw this amazing four-wheel drive vehicle, the frame of it imprisoned like a insect in amber. And to most people, I think these suicide bombings were mysterious. They were evil events. They were killing civilians, great numbers of civilians. They seemed to be random. And one of the skills I think I brought to bear, which I really think was directly from my undergraduate education in philosophy and literature, comparative literature, was trying to read these events and trying to, in reading them, constructing a logic between them that told me what the author of those events was trying to achieve. And I think I was able to do that, basically to suggest that whoever it was, and it turned out to be Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later became ISIS, of course, was the group. At that time, it was completely unknown. Nobody knew it existed. But eventually, if you looked at the events, what they bombed, the Jordanian embassy, the Turkish embassy, the UN, the Red Cross, killing in each case 20, 25 people, they were seeming to snip away the very fragile wires that connected the American expedition in Iraq to the international community. That is, the Jordanians had said, we're going to send troops to replace the Americans. Boom, their embassy was blown up, 20 people killed. The UN said, we're going to try to negotiate bringing in other kinds of troops here to make this an international operation. Boom, their headquarters was blown up. Sergio de Mello, the great delegate for the UN, who had served so well in Bosnia and various other places, was assassinated, was killed. One by one, you had these attacks. I went out to the base of the Italian multinational, or the Italian forces, and the terrorism specialist there said, look at us, we're about to be hit. And indeed, within a week, they were hit. And my emphasis here is that I was trying to read these and trying to find out a kind of logic. And indeed, once you find out that kind of logic, you can not only know what's going on around you, and of course, when you plunge into a situation like Iraq, you're just besieged with sense impressions. People tell you things, you're astonished by what the city looks like. There are the explosions, there are the bodies, there's the lurid voluptuousness of the here and now that you're suddenly plunged into. And the trick is to try to hang it on a kind of logic. And I think that philosophy helped me kind of sit down, look at something, and try to connect it, phenomena, in a rather organized way. I'd give another example, which I wrote a book called The Massacre at El Mosote, which is originally a piece for The New Yorker. And there was a critical memo that an embassy secretary, young embassy official from the embassy in San Salvador, had sent back to the American government about the massacre, about people he interviewed, this massacre that killed 1,000 people, including 125 children. He had sent this memo that essentially denied that it happened. It was a lie, in fact, this memo, and it allowed the American government to deny these murders had happened because the American government was allied with the Salvadoran government. But if you read deep into the memo, you found a great many contradictions, things that Freud would have seized on, strange mistakes, slips of the tongue, as it were, in Freudian language. And if you read it very closely, you could find and discover that, in fact, there were ambiguities and ambivalences when it came to the reporting officer. And in fact, the memo told much more than it purported to tell in the executive summary. So I think that's a couple of examples of the way I think my undergraduate education has been extremely useful. It's about looking at things and trying to understand them. And that's, I think, what a true humanist education is. It's about looking, seeing, understanding. And I had a very good, I think, education in that regard. I was very lucky.
That's very interesting. Well, Mark, it's true that what you say is all very true, but everyone in the room has probably read Plato and done aesthetics and all that, but almost none of us have actually seen the suicide bomb explosion like a few feet away. So there's something special about you that took you from the world of the humanities or liberal arts into a very different world. And what drew you to go toward these events that most of us are fleeing in the other direction?
My mother used to say, and it's actually the dedication of the book Stripping Bare the Body. The dedication is to my mother in partial answer of her constant question, why can't you go somewhere nice for a change?
Let's stay in Utica.
That's right, stay in Utica, New York, exactly. We're both upstaters, upstate New York.
And you easily get a job in a local newspaper.
Yeah.
The question might seem naive to you, but to other people it's actually a sort of profound question. Why are journalists who write about war and conflict like this, what actually drives you? Are you actually different sorts of people?
I don't know about different sorts of people. I know that there's a lust, at least that many people have, to be on the cutting edge of history. That is, to be where things are happening, where events, you hear, to use Iraq again, what you read about Iraq, even if you are closely following Iraq, is what's already been through the minds of various people who are witnessing it and who are reconstructing events. To actually be there and find yourself bewildered by events. The closer you get, the less you know. It's an amazing phenomenon about reporting because you don't realize at a distance it's being pre-chewed for you, right? So when you actually get there, you suddenly know nothing at all. And that is, I'd use the word again, a kind of voluptuous thrill to know what's happening. The second thing I'd say, and it's connected, is that phrase, stripping bare the body, comes from a longer quote from a former Haitian president. Like many, he served for 5 months before he was overthrown in a coup. And he said, political violence is like stripping bare the body, the better to place the stethoscope and hear what goes on beneath the skin. So at times of political stress and political conflict, you really can see into a society to understand the various forces that are alive there. And that goes for not only Iraq, Central America, the Balkans, but the United States during the War on Terror, when, for example, the US tortured prisoners. Well, you wouldn't have said 15 years ago, or 20 years ago rather, that the United States would ever actually torture, legally, quote unquote, prisoners. That was all we were all about the Enlightenment values. That's what the country was built on. But in fact, you needed to see the society under this kind of stress to see that when put under stress, the US behaved not unlike the Argentines. There were obviously different situations, the scale was different, but in fact, there was a very similar response. So I think that's also a lure to actually see into a society. Finally, there's just the excitement. Wordsworth said, bliss was it in that age to be alive, but to be young was very heaven, speaking about the French Revolution. And I think in general, revolutions, coups, invasions, you have a kind of plasticity about the world that things can change. Things that you regarded as set, as established, as known, as incontestable, can suddenly be put in question and in play. And that's a very exciting time to be somewhere. I think people tend to focus finally on the violence, and that can be very frightening. You know, I'm just like anybody else. You know, in front of violence, I get frightened. But that's, in a funny way, just the surface phenomenon of something much larger that's going on, I think. And finally, people are in, and this is connected to that last point, you see people in a kind of extremis. You see people at the end of their tether. You see societies at the end of their tether. And not only is that fascinating, but you want to tell that to the rest of the world. I mean, there is a kind of responsibility part of it. Marie Colvin, who is a friend of mine who died in Syria a few years ago, a wonderful, great reporter, always talked about bearing witness, that if she would go to places where others couldn't go, and eventually, indeed, in Homs, Syria, she was killed by shelling, but she used this phrase, bearing witness, that if I'm not here reporting on this, nobody else is. That's rarely been the case when I've reported. You know, there were people in Sarajevo, there was people in various other places I've been, but you feel like somebody has to go and somebody has to tell.
What was your first assignment overseas?
Haiti. I had a great friend. Talking about my education, I was blessed with a number of great mentors, and one of them was a man named James Chase, who had been managing editor of Foreign Affairs, then worked at the New York Times, biographer of Atchison, a wonderful scholar and very charming, great writer, very charming man, who was working at the New York Times when I was at the Times Magazine, and who one day said to me, "Young Danner, go to Hispaniola, go to Hispaniola." And he, at the time, Duvalier was being overthrown, the great dictator, actually the son of the great dictator, at the end of a 29-year dictatorship. And he perceived this as a great story. You know, the society itself is fascinating. He was being overthrown. There was a political transition going on. His idea, James's idea, was I would go to the Dominican Republic, which shares the island of Hispaniola with Haiti. Then I would come back and do a piece in 2 weeks talking about both, and that would be it. I'd go on to other stories. I ended up covering Haiti for 15 years or so for the New Yorker, for the New York Times, for various other places. And I was just fascinated by it. And it was a wonderful place to write about because it was a fascinatingly complicated place, enormous complexity of politics. They've had presidents for life, kings, emperors. The country's been divided in half into a kingdom and an empire. Almost always there's an overthrow and a coup d'etat. That's how they sort of, you're either president for life or you're overthrown in a coup d'etat. There's an incredible politique de peau, politics of skin color, struggles between the mulattoes and the blacks that go back forever. I mean, it's just, and also the people are the most charming people on the face of the earth. You know, they're incredibly attractive, fascinating people. The country, though it's the size of Maryland, as the journalistic phrase has it, is actually vast. To get from one end to the other, because the roads are so bad, can take days. So it's both huge and tiny at the same time. And it was a wonderful first assignment. I was fascinated by it, charmed by it. It was small enough that you could get to know all the major politicians. The day I arrived, I found myself in the presidential palace. Through a strange set of connections. And that night, at this incredible party of the elite, at which I saw 100 of the most beautiful people I've ever seen, you know, this incredible gathering.
How old were you then?
I was 28, maybe. I had already worked at the New York Review and the Harper's. I'd been an editor. Another great mentor of mine, Robert Silvers, who died this past year, was the editor of the New York Review.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. You know, you, as a journalist, you have written for the most distinguished publications there are. You mentioned the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Harper's Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, and Foreign Affairs, and some others. So I was just going to ask, as a journalist, would you speak of your experience, particularly with any particular editor who sort of mentored you or gave you assignments and then called you on the phone to make sure you were doing them?
Well, Robert B. Silvers was my longtime editor. He was the founding editor of the New York Review of Books, founded it with Barbara Epstein in 1963. I met him in 1981 when I graduated from college. I was lying on my bed in Harvard Square for about 6 weeks without moving. And I thought I was, I was clearly profoundly depressed, not knowing what I was going to do. At the time, I thought I was resting, you know. So I eventually, through a couple of strange events, I found myself at the New York Review talking to Bob Silvers, and he hired me. He was a charming man, very handsome, looked like the Hollywood definition of a New York editor. But brilliant man, vast knowledge of just about everything, a photographic memory. But what I benefited from above all else was a kind of sense of dedication, devotion, and loyalty. He decided he liked my work, and that was it. You know, he essentially, whatever I wanted to cover, he said, go ahead and do it. And then as you,
that was it. Yeah.
and then as you imply, he would call me up, you know, when he didn't get it. And he was very tactful. He wouldn't say, where's the piece? He would call me up and start talking about something. And I knew very well this is why I was calling. In fact, I was tempted to avoid it when we got, you know, caller ID. The worst thing about caller ID, where I would see New York Review of Books. But he would talk to me very tactfully, and in some way, these conversations seemed to unlock, you know, writing. I don't know how he did it. And he died in March, and I'm was very deeply affected by it and still am. And he was a wonderful editor in all kinds of senses. An editor has to be both someone who knows what the story is, who looks beyond the headlines to see what the story should be in 3 weeks or a month or 2 months, who can take a sentence and see what's wrong with it, who can understand what's wrong with the structure of a piece, who has good taste about writing, who, when he says, no, 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 don't use that word, you can trust him. I mean, I remember I did a series on Haiti for Bob, actually, and it was about Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was who'd been a priest and became the president of Haiti. Some say he became a dictator. I knew him from when he was a priest, because I met him when I first went to Haiti in '86. And anyway, he gave this amazing, he was an astonishing speaker. And he gave this amazing sermon before they tried to kill him in his church, killed 26 people, but didn't succeed in killing him. And at a certain point I said, and then came the peroration. Peroration. In fact, the word was absolutely used correctly. And Bob just sent, you know, I got the galleys back, and then came the climax of the speech. And I was like, no, then came the peroration. I replaced it, sent it back. Copy, you know, the B galley came to me. Then came the highlight of the speech. Peroration. I sent it back. Finally, after the C and D galley, and I always got a C, D, and sometimes an E galley from Bob, which is remarkable, but he knew I was a perfectionist, and he was fine with that, because he was too. We finally had this argument. And at the end of the day, he basically said, well, Mark, he had this wonderful mid-Atlantic accent. Well, Mark, you know, you can, listen, it's your piece. Use the bloody word if you want to. You know, I understand you're insisting. All right, I'm not going to insist. Use the bloody word if you want to. All right, let's go on to something else. And of course, as soon as I put the phone down, I thought, no, I can't use that word. He's certainly right. And I would trust him in that way. So peroration never appeared, needless to say. And, you know, I could call him from, first of all, he was at the office until 4 a.m. every night, which meant I could call him at any hour, and he would pick up the phone.
4 a.m.
4 a.m. And I would call him, he had a bedroom in his office. So I would call him from Iraq and just indeed have these conversations, you know, that were utterly fertile for me about what I should be thinking about. You know, in fact, I think it was him who originally said, well, Mark, you know, you have all these bombings. They're extraordinarily bloody and incredibly, just awful stuff, these suicide bombings, simultaneous. It's just amazing. We look at these. But, you know, it's fascinating to me because we don't really know what they mean, do we? I think he said that to me first. And he would say things like that were just so provocative. And he also had a kind of loyalty that, you know, I knew if I decided I wanted to write on X, no matter how bizarre it was, he would almost certainly publish it, or he would make it publishable and then publish it. I would call up and say, Bob, the inauguration is going to happen. I really want, absolutely, and I'd be going to Trump's inauguration. Or I would say, Trump is going to be in Pittsburgh. I think this is an interesting place to see him, in the suburbs of Pittsburgh. The ticket, he would put one of his, this is a job I had. It was called editorial assistant. You worked directly for the editor. We referred to it informally as slaves. And he would put one of his slaves on it, and I would be off I would go to Pittsburgh, and they'd rent me a car, and I'd drive to Philadelphia and see Clinton. And he just supported me relentlessly in a way that I can't compare it to anybody else. And he was an absolutely astounding editor. I did a series on Bosnia, these enormous pieces. I think the New York Review couldn't publish anything like them anymore. One was nearly 40,000 words. This was during the 90s. And I would send them in, and then we would edit them together during the night. And sometimes it went from 2 a.m. to 5. I remember lying there as the sun was going up, and lying on my back because I felt like I had hurt my back. And we finally had gotten through the piece, and there were about 40 footnotes. And one of the most laborious parts of editing a piece like that is the footnotes somehow get out of order, and you're not sure where, and you have to go through them. And I remember just weekly, these were like these endurance contests. I remember just weekly saying, Bob, can we just do the footnotes in a little while? Can we get off the phone? And he's, of course, in New York, and it's, he's about to start his day. He's been there all night. And he was at the time, he was 30 years older than me. And I remember him saying, absolutely not. The setter's about to get here, to set it. And at a certain point, I had to get up finally when we were done, and it turned out I had pneumonia. That's why my back was sore. So I went off to the hospital thinking somewhere Bob is changing his shirt and starting a full day in Manhattan, his job in Manhattan. So it was astonishing.
It suggests something about the world of journalism and high quality nonfiction, that you have not only writers who are very devoted and energetic and courageous, but editors.
That's very true. That's really true.
I knew Bob Silvers also, though not nearly as well as Mark did. And you didn't mention this, but it's a really wonderful detail, that Bob Silvers had 2 office staffs. What were the hours, like 8?
There were 9 to 5 and then 2 to 10.
But then he was also there by himself.
Yeah, when I first worked for him, I always did the 2 to 10 shift, because then I could go to the Frick in the morning, or the Met, or usually go to a museum. And then I would go, and the thing is, it was supposedly I think it was 2 to 9, actually. It was supposedly 2 to 10 or 2 to 9. But he had this outbox on his desk, and he had this big desk, and you had this little desk down sort of beneath the throne. And he would, as the hour got near when you were supposed to leave, he would start throwing things into the outbox that you had to look at, so that you wouldn't be able to leave, because you had this, you had that, you had to do these things. And I remember I finally got this job at Harper's, and the last night I was there, Bob hadn't referred to this at all, or, that I was leaving. He just threw this pile of stuff in the outbox, and I was there until midnight, and I finally just said, Bob, I just have to go. I just have to go. And he said, well, thanks. Well, kiddo, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. But he did, he has this amazing, very dedicated staff, and it's the best job in New York for someone wanting to begin a career, because you meet everybody, you learn how to edit, you learn what being a great editor is. It's just a wonderful job. But the hours are long and the pay sucks.
Well, Bob Silvers was also a very inquisitive and inquiring mind. So he would actually want to know something, and that's why he would send somebody out to work. It wasn't just that he was publishing something that might be spectacular or sensational to sell copies of his paper, but he actually literally himself wanted to know, because he had said to me, apropos he said, well, I wanted to know about Trump. Nobody has really explained Trump the way he needs to be explained, and only Mark Danner can do that. So I said to him, Mark out to do it. And I thought it was kind of interesting that he's sitting here, he needs some great mystery dealt with, and there's only one person in the whole world who can do it, and he sort of matches the two.
I'm so glad you said that, because I never got a compliment from him, you know? In fact, the very last piece I did,
You never.
well, the very last piece I did, which was on Trump, he called me back, as usual, it was, you know, the printers were there, it had to be, you know, I always did things last minute, and he put up with it, thank God. And he called me up, you know, I sent it in, he called me up, he was clearly rushing it to the setters to have it set and type. And he said, yeah, we have to do this, we've done a few things, all right. And you know, what's brilliant about it is, and some toss-off line about what's brilliant about it is this, and then he hung up. And I just was left holding the phone saying, did he really say that? I can't believe he actually said that, because I think it was the first time he had ever complimented me in any way.
I think that can be true, actually, because he would write a letter to me and say, thank you for your splendid review, and the way he'd have some criticism or some suggestions. He probably did the same. Did you save his letters?
I did, although because of what I've just explained, which is that it was always the last minute. It was all by phone, really.
I realized he died about a year ago in the later part of March, and realized belatedly that I saved almost none of his wonderful letters.
Yeah.
You know, just somehow.
Well, he saved them. They're in the archive somewhere.
Oh, well, that's Well, it's so interesting to hear you talk. I think many of us are just so impressed with your writing, which is really extraordinary. What I read to you is so vivid and ardent and alive, but also the courage that's involved in this sort of physical risk-taking. And I think that many of us whose consciousness of the world is filtered through books, if we went out into the field, you know, as you did, we would have to be prepared in some way by having read something so that there would be a way of interpreting it. The only kind of writing I've ever done of action that was unfolding in front of my eyes, it's very hard to do that kind of writing. It's not like Wordsworth spoke of emotion, recollection, and tranquility.
Absolutely.
You know, where most of what we do is very, very thoughtful and even calibrated. Though I wrote about boxing a few times. I wrote about live boxing matches. So when I was quite young, I mean relatively young, and that was so difficult. I was at Mike Tyson's the fight that won him the heavyweight championship. So I was sort of, you were seeing a physical spectacle that's much too rapid for language. You have not the words to put it in. You are literally just like an optic nerve. You see this happening. You have really no words for it. So the way boxing writers dealt with it, the way I did, you see tapes of it. So then I'd see the tape. Oh, that's what happened. And you see it again. Oh, I missed that before. In other words, the boxing is so fast when they're good boxers, the eye can hardly take it in. Only later, you're creating a text. You have to think of a first sentence. Like what I read to you of Mark's writing is very characteristic of much of his writing. But I think the Trump pieces that you did took you to almost another level of visceral, vivid, dramatizing, and also subjective writing, a little more than in this book. This is more analytical and cool. Yeah. That is more right in the midst of it.
I think it's one of the things, I mean, all writers, any bit of narrative, a key point is how to engage the reader, you know.
The text, creating the text.
Creating the text, and also the kind of motor of prose, the motor of narrative, actually the motor of probably any art that unfolds in time is suspense, which is, and suspense is in some way suspending attention, of course, wanting to suspend I guess you're delving into, how should I put it? You're suspending discovery of who someone is, for example, when it comes to Trump, I think. So the beginning is a vivid depiction of what it feels like to be touched by him. I mean, this is my analyzing what you read, and doing it in a way that seems to be symbolic of something larger about him. And what could be more symbolic than the rain? I mean, it doesn't know enough to get out of the rain. Raining is about as basic as a thing as, when rain's falling on your face, it is raining. And yet a day later, he says, it wasn't, it's not. And he eventually imposes that view, at least on himself, and probably on a lot of other people. But so the beginning is a vivid entry into who he is, a key part of him, and his effect on us. And the suspense has to do with finding out who he is, finding out an explanation for that.
And I think also you set aside any preconceived notions that you had, going towards rallies, for instance, so that it's almost like you immerse yourself in the phenomenon of the experience so that you're not exactly critical or judging, but you're caught up in this wave, so you can almost identify with some of the people in the rally.
I think I'm very happy to hear you say that because, it's an amazing thing to stand in an aircraft hangar with 30,000 people so tightly wedged in that you cannot move. So you can't move your elbows. And you are there, think about this for a minute, for 3 hours, waiting until he gets there. So you're like this, people are sweating, it's incredibly hot, and you're just there, and people are yelling, they're very boisterous, they're yelling USA, there are beach balls thrown up in the air and knocked around like at a rock concert.
Did they know you went to Harvard?
Yeah. Well, actually, you talked about courage a moment ago, and I was gonna say, the greatest courage I think I ever needed was not in Iraq or somewhere like that, but at a Trump rally where he gave this speech, this was in West Palm Beach, about the traitors in our midst and about the international capital, and it was the most Bannon-esque of his speeches. And I was standing there. I don't like to stand. There's a cage where they put journalists, but I don't usually do that. I get in the crowd, which is fine usually. But I'm standing there with a notebook, and people around you can't help noticing you're taking notes and realize that you're a journalist. And the angrier he was getting, he was really yelling at journalists and how disreputable they were, and CNN sucks, and pointing to CNN, pointing to the press. And I had all these people immediately around me, stuck very close to me, who, thank goodness, many of them I had spoken to in the run-up to the rally, so they weren't obliged to. But the people who were a little farther away looked at me with and I realized I couldn't get out. If somebody was going to punch me, there was nothing I could do about it. So
fascinating. Yeah. Well, and also then when you go back home to write and when you're thinking about it, I would assume that you're positioning yourself in some way strategically in terms of other writers who dealt with phenomena like this. Who are your great predecessors, books and articles? People have written about some of the same things that you've written about.
Gosh, I don't know. That's a very good question. I mean, there are a lot of, I'm a maniacal reader, and there are a lot of writers I enormously admire.
Well, I know you teach Mike Hare, and he has a lot of action.
He's terrific. He's very much more subjective than I am. I mean, he's incredibly subjective he's an observer, a deep observer of himself, and he was perfect as the voice of the Vietnam War. He was, it's a really good example of the conjunction of writer and the reporter and what's reported, the Vietnam War, Michael Hare.
Did you know Michael?
I didn't know him. I know you did.
I didn't know him well. I thought it was so fascinating that he would write this incredibly compelling, surpassingly beautiful and terrifying book. And then later on in his life, he became a Buddhist and didn't write anymore. There's something about that, and he never really wrote anything as good as Dispatches. He must have been in his 20s.
Yeah, I think he was. They were written in the early 70s, obviously, and it's a fantastic book. Although I have a different. I mean, to me, it would be great if he had written more, but thank goodness he wrote that. It was.
Unlike you, he didn't move on. He seems to have been not frozen, but sort of fixated there.
Yeah.
Tim O'Brien is another writer who sort of fixated in that era. But you moved on. I mean, you've done a number of things, reporting on the Balkan War when you were just in your 20s. And now you've been writing in recent years very much about terrorism and counterterrorism.
And
So,
torture, a lot on torture as well.
This book, Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War, is not cheerful reading. It's very, very profoundly realistic, and what you say is so grim, and that was during the Obama era. So you can just sort of extrapolate from that what it must be like right now.
Well, actually, I was already covering the campaign when I did the introduction.
I see.
But, it's fascinating that I've written about wars my whole professional life, and we're now in a permanent war, and we're at war. A decent, I think, definition of war would put us at war in 7 countries, active warfare. And people basically aren't paying attention. I mean, it's a remarkable thing, it seems to me. And this was an attempt to take up that question of endless war. And the fact that the phenomenon of terrorism, terrorism also, I mentioned this at the beginning to answer to your first question about my education. I mean, terrorism is a kind of talking. It's a kind of talking. And it's saying something. And we've essentially, the United States responded to the terrorist attacks, the 9/11 attacks since, by essentially doing what they wanted. It's a remarkable thing, that they wanted the U.S. to invade Afghanistan. That was the plan of how to destroy the United States. The U.S. not only invaded Afghanistan, but Iraq as well. They wanted the United States to invade a Muslim country to increase the recruitment for terrorist groups. The United States did that. At the time, there was this multinational terrorist group that was ruthless, trying to attack the U.S., but also overthrow Muslim regimes. Now there are 2 of them. There was one at the time, Al-Qaeda, now there are 2. There's ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so the U.S., if you look at any of the metrics about what the United States has done with respect to the so-called war on terror, the number of terrorists has increased by an order of magnitude. And I think that is a fascinating thing. I think it also is bound up with some of the ways that we fought and the ways that we've done things that, as Obama was fond of putting it, are not what we are. Yeah. Torture is not what we are. Guantanamo is not what we are. In fact, it's what we do. So how can it not be what we are, but at the same time be what we do?
You use the phrase "a state of exception." Well, we should open to questions from the audience if anyone has.
Well, Mark, you did emphasize that the state of exception is now the acceptable norm in Spiral. And I'm just wondering, it reminds me of, again, Robert Lichtman's statement about the Germans about the gradual socialization of their society, unthinkable before. I'm also wondering how it may illustrate how we're willing to sacrifice our diplomacy for the sake of very narrow political goals inside the country.
Can you give an example of the sacrifice of the diplomacy for?
Well, what we're seeing in the State Department being reduced gradually, the reaction is more toward reaction rather than let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Interesting that now in Afghanistan, the Afghani president is coming forward now. He says, "Yeah, we'll talk with the hostile forces. We're not going to wait for."
Well, I think the present leadership of the country, certainly the political leadership, has a very primitive view of use of force and how international politics, how that game is played. He essentially thinks it has to do with force, period. And one of the things Trump did when he got into office was change the rules of engagement, the so-called ROEs, which allowed the military to bomb much more frequently and with greater certainty that they would kill civilians. The rules of engagement had been tightened to try to prevent exactly what I just referred to, which is the production of great numbers of terrorists as a result of our reaction to them, which is, of course, what they do. You know, that's what terrorism is for. It's a strategy of provocation whereby a very weak organization, very weak group, takes on a stronger one, provokes the stronger one to overreact, and thereby grows itself. That's the dynamic. And Trump is an incredible sucker for that. So he's been essentially playing into their hands. It is true that he's demolished, or is on the way to demolishing much of the State Department. Mattis, General Mattis, the current Secretary of Defense, when he was head of Central Command, he actually said during congressional testimony, if you're going to reduce the State Department staffing, you should tell me, Senator, because I need to get more ammunition. I mean, he has recognized this before. I think it's profoundly unwise, and I think the military thinks it's profoundly unwise. I mean, the U.S. military has a lot of experience of being called by the nation's leadership to solve what are political problems. This is a long-time tendency of the U.S. to use the military to solve problems that are political in essence. And, you know, Napoleon supposedly said, when I was at the New Yorker, they almost wouldn't let me use this because I couldn't find the quote, but supposedly said, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it, which is a vivid image, of course. But he meant by that you can't establish a lasting order by force of arms and violence. That's something that the military cannot do. Other institutions of government have to do that. And the U.S. has increasingly forgotten about that. You know, during the last, I have students now whose entire lifetimes have been spent basically under the war on terror, during which the U.S. has fought and lost 2 large wars. We don't admit this, of course. You know, it's shocking. We lost the Iraq War? Yeah, we did. The Iranians control Iraq now. That was a catastrophic mistake, as I argued here on this campus a number of times. And we're in the process of losing the Afghan war, of course. Anyway, I went a bit far afield from that question.
Any other questions?
First of all, I've seen many of your articles. Thank you so much. I really love them.
Thank you.
So you wrote the article, What Will He Do? Do you have a sequence?
You mean, do I want to prophesize what's going to happen? Or?
Well, I don't know, prophecies is stronger, but maybe just imagine.
Well, I think that, first of all, I'm so glad you read, that Joyce read the first section, because it holds up pretty well, having been written a year ago. I mean, he has colonized our minds. And this is very important, because this is what the big man does. You know, in Latin America, I gave a course in the English department here called Portraits in Black, which was about dictator novels. And Trump is, I'm not saying he's a dictator because he isn't, but he has many characteristics of them. And the biggest one is this kind of colonization of the national mind, this absolute drive to control the conversation and the points of view and the mental landscape of the citizenry. And he has effectively done that. I think this investigation by Mueller is very serious. I think they will find things that would constitute high crimes and misdemeanors, except that is a politically definable term. It's not a legal term. So the key question of that investigation will really be, to whom will the evidence be turned over to? I think that if the Democrats win this year's elections in the House, or not to speak of in the Senate, I think it's fairly likely he'll be impeached. Whether he could be convicted, be the first president ever to be convicted, I don't know. It's very doubtful. The bar on that is very, very high. But these are all, you know, who knows. I thought he would win. And I kept telling myself I was crazy because everybody said he wouldn't win. And yet I would go to his rallies, they would be packed with tens of thousands of people. Hers were a complete snooze. I'm talking about Mrs. Clinton. I mean, not very many people showed up. She was very ineffective as a campaigner. But I would never claim that I'm effective in predicting the future. What really worries me most is what's going on in two places, the Korean Peninsula and with respect to Iran. Because I think in the Persian Gulf, you have a new ruler in the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia who is very rambunctious, and not to speak of belligerent. And I think that situation could get out of hand. I think the Korea situation is really kind of a disaster. And he is continually threatening the use of nuclear weapons, which until Trump, we did not do. People did not do that. He's threatening the use of nuclear weapons. And in fact, there is no military solution without the deaths of tens of thousands of people in Korea. So I see a kind of conflict there that I don't know the answer to. I really don't. It's a bit frightening to me. Sorry to be so reassuring.
So just to pick up on what you were saying a minute ago about Trump colonizing our minds, and to circle back to the question of journalism. So what do you think about the role of the press in that process of colonization, or what a potential response should be?
Well, I think the press is torn, and I wrote this in the New York Review, because as he has pointed out, he is very good for the press. Everybody's making a lot of money. The Times is making a lot of money. CBS News, Les Moonves, the president of CBS, said during the campaign, I don't know whether Trump is good for the country, but he's very good for CBS News. Or he's very good for CBS, I think he said. And Trump himself, quite recently in an interview with the New York Times, said, I'm going to win re-election because they're not going to be able to part with me, essentially. You know, the press needs me so much. And in fact, that sounds like his typical insane braggadocio, but in fact, there's a lot of truth to the fact that he is very good business. People are paying attention to politics in a way that they haven't. Politics has become a reality show. So the press, as a commercial press, you know, there's an inherent contradiction in a commercial press, because the press is supposed to print what's newsworthy, and in fact, the press prints both what's newsworthy and what makes money. And theoretically, those things overlap perfectly, but they do not. And so there are contradictions that are exposed in the press every day. That's one problem. Second problem is that he has had a measurable effect, I think, on the partisanship of the press. The New York Times never would have published a full page of Trump's lies, of a previous president's lies. It just never would have happened before. And well, that's true. You're quite right, but they had a few.
Lyndon Johnson would be
Yeah, you just can't imagine. I mean, I take your point. Trump is different. And this is what they say, I'm sure, in their editorial meetings. Trump is different. I mean, they raise exactly that question that Tim raised. But, you know, how do we cover him? What do we do? He's lying all the time. We can't just use our stenographic function and publish these things. We have to contradict them. So we use the word lies. I understand they're in a difficult position, but it has had this corrupting influence on this notion of objectivity, which itself is, needless to say, a deeply imperfect notion, but it is not contentless. It is real. So I feel like the press has been dragged across a kind of line that it will have great difficulty in recrossing, I think.
He's like Gorgeous George. Do you remember the wrestler?
I do.
Everybody loved to hate Gorgeous George, so they would buy tickets to his wrestling matches. They wanted to see him defeated. But in the meantime, he was making a lot of money.
Right.
So that's...
I think Trump would enjoy the comparison to Gorgeous George.
I hate to be the least person, but I think that might be a really great place to stop, because it's
On Gorgeous George?
Gorgeous George. So I think we should thank our guests.
Thank you.